Hello and welcome to The Signal, WorkplaceNL's Health and Safety Podcast. WorkplaceNL is the Workers' Compensation Board in Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. The focus is to promote safe and healthy workplaces, provide return-to-work programs, and offer compensation to injured workers and their dependents. This series of podcasts will provide you with the latest information on how workplaces can protect the health and safety of workers. Please enjoy the show.
Good day, everyone. My name is Deanne Feltham-Scott, Occupational Health and Safety Educational Consultant in Prevention Services at WorkplaceNL. Every provincially regulated workplace in the province is required to have a harassment prevention plan. We've had many questions from employers and workers on how to meet their legislative obligations in creating a workplace that is free from harassment. Today, we welcome Lisa Kavanagh from WorkplaceNL and Linda Sagmeister from the Occupational Health and Safety Division of the Digital Government and Service NL Department. They will answer some frequently asked questions on this topic. Welcome to the episode, Lisa and Linda.
Thanks, Deanne.
So workplace harassment is certainly a topic that's getting a lot of attention. As you know, we do have that requirement now for employers to have a harassment prevention plan. No matter how many workers you have in your workplace, all provincially regulated employers are required to have this plan. And as we are becoming more educated on the topic itself, we're getting more questions about that. So let's begin with a clarification on your respective organizational roles in harassment prevention in the workplace. Lisa, let's begin with you. What role does WorkplaceNL play?
Well, Deanne, WorkplaceNL really aims to create awareness and educate workplaces on harassment prevention. We're available to consult with employers as they develop their own harassment prevention plans, and we can also provide general education to workplaces either in person or virtually. And also, WorkplaceNL has just recently released a new online course called Preventing Harassment in the Workplace, and that's free for anybody to use.
And it is an excellent course. Thank you for sharing that. Linda, what is the role of the Occupational Health and Safety Division?
The OHS division enforces the Occupational Health and Safety Act and regulations for this province, and that is our primary mandate. So the regulations right now do include, as you mentioned, sections about harassment prevention, and they've got employer and worker obligations and requirements in there. So OHS officers ensure that employers have met those obligations and complied with the regulations that way.
Right.
But we can't actually investigate any accusations or allegations of harassment themselves. Yeah. That's the requirement of the employer to perform according to our regulations.
Right. So what is harassment?
Well, I can tell you what the definition of harassment is in our regulations.
Okay.
And that would be that it's the inappropriate, vexatious conduct or comment by a person to a worker that the person knew or ought to have known would cause the worker to be humiliated, offended, or intimidated.
Right.
Now, I do realize that some of those words are a little bit not often used, like vexatious.
Vexatious, absolutely.
But it does mean, the main point there is that if you're behaving in a way that most people would recognize as being humiliating or offensive,
right,
or embarrassing, or if there's bullying involved, then that generally fits the definition of harassment.
Vexatious.
Lisa, did you want to maybe provide some examples of what that harassing behavior might look like?
Sure, Linda. So typically, harassment is a pattern of behavior. It can be written, verbal, physical, a gesture, or even a display. And it can be intended or unintended. So, it's not the intent, it's how it's received and the impact that you have on others.
Yeah.
So some examples of harassment could include exclusion or isolation of people, maybe spreading rumors or malicious gossip, making inappropriate gestures or comments, and even cyberbullying, such as posting offensive or intimidating messages, and it could be through social media or email. Those are just a few examples. There's an exhaustive list that we could go through.
I guess it really depends on the individual situation.
Absolutely.
And I guess the way or the behaviors and actions that somebody takes against somebody that would be considered harassing by the receiver. I guess that's probably what it comes down to. So is it still harassment, though, if it only happens once? Like it's just one incident?
Yes, Deanne, it certainly can be. Harassment is normally a series of events. However, one single incident can constitute harassment, where it's demonstrated that it's severe and it has a significant and lasting impact on the complainant.
Where does workplace harassment typically take place? Like, does it have to be in the workplace, like the actual physical building?
That's a great question, Deanne, because harassment can happen anywhere. Mm-hmm. As long as you're actually working and, completing work-related business, you could be at a conference for work and be harassed there by someone. You could be, like Lisa said, it could be on social media.
Yeah.
So as long as it's work-related, then it's considered to be harassment as long as you take into account everything we just said about what harassment is and that it's not the intent, it's how it's received and so on.
If harassment is taking place in a workplace, it can certainly lead to a psychological injury if we don't put measures in place to actually prevent that harassment from happening. So what do employers in the province have to do to prevent harassment in their workplaces?
The main thing to realize is that the new regulations, well, they're 3 years plus old now.
That's right.
The main thing that it requires is the development, implementation, and maintenance of a harassment prevention plan. So people need to recognize that it's not just that they have one. They have to implement it into the workplace, and they have to review it at least annually or maybe more often, depending on what happens.
Right.
And the plan's required to include statements. And when I say it's required, I'm talking about what's in the regulations.
Right.
So the regulations stipulate that various statements need to be there to show what the employer is going to do or intends to do, and then they actually have to do that. And it also has to include procedures that clearly show anyone who picks up the harassment prevention plan what to expect in various situations.
Right.
And that is the big bulk of it. But they also are required to train everyone and to participate in training on harassment prevention, as well as to provide training to employees and, well, all workers really, on their own workplace harassment prevention plan.
Right.
So that's specific to each workplace.
And does that include the employer?
Absolutely. Well, the employer definitely has to be involved in or participate in harassment prevention in general, training. But they need to be aware of and understand their own harassment prevention plan as well.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Okay. So the way that you just described that program sounds a lot like a respectful workplace policy to me. Is that the same as a harassment prevention plan?
It is, and I think, Lisa, you've probably noticed this a lot in all the different plans that you've looked at, too. Have you noticed all the different names?
Absolutely, Linda. A harassment prevention plan can be referred to by many different names, so different employers will call it different things. In some places, they may call it a respectful workplace policy. Regardless of the title of the document, it has to include all of the elements of a harassment prevention plan as prescribed by the OH&S regulations. So if it's called a respectful workplace policy or program, but it has all of the requirements outlined in the legislation, that would be okay. But that is the thing. It has to meet the legislative requirement.
Exactly. So we've reviewed the definition of harassment, and I guess at this point in the podcast, if anyone is listening and that they feel that they are involved in a situation that would meet this definition, and if they feel that they're being harassed at work, who would they report this situation to?
The key is to follow the employer's harassment prevention plan.
That's right.
Because that should be outlined within the plan who harassment should be reported to within that workplace. Another piece is, even though it must be reported to the employer, it may involve, other agencies. It can be human rights. It could be police, depending on the situation.
Right.
And, if you contact these other agencies, they will decide if the complaint actually falls within their jurisdiction, but
Right.
everything should be reported to the employer as outlined in the Harassment Prevention Plan.
Yeah.
And if I could just add to that, Lisa, another thing that occurs to me is when I was telling you about the responsibilities of employers, one of them is that they have to investigate complaints
That's right.
of harassment. So that's another reason why if you go to the Human Rights Commission, it's well within your rights to do that. But you really need to report it, according to your harassment prevention plan, to your employer, because it's their responsibility to investigate it.
Right.
Or at least have it investigated.
Right. Exactly. So what if the alleged harasser is somebody's direct manager or supervisor? Does that follow a little different of a process, or is it the same process?
It is a bit of a different process, because if you think about it, an investigator who's looking into a harassment complaint needs to be impartial. And clearly, if it's your supervisor or manager,
That's
or
right.
somebody of authority, that's the respondent, who is that's how we refer to somebody about whom the claims are made, then they can't be impartial because they're actually involved. So for that reason, the regulations require that every harassment prevention plan provide a means for people to make a report to an external contact.
Right.
And that external contact isn't necessarily someone who does the investigation. It's another person to report your allegations or your complaint to. That is not somebody to whom you report, or so on. Somebody who's going to have some power and authority over you.
Yeah.
So that contact has to then make the decision about whether or not everything meets the requirements or the definition of harassment.
Right.
And if it does, they've got to help facilitate getting somebody to do an external investigation, because
Right.
you won't get the impartiality from internal.
Right.
If you were to make a complaint to your employer and you went to follow the harassment prevention plan and that external contact was not there, then I would recommend calling OHS.
Right.
Because we can help to ensure that it gets put in place for that purpose.
So we know that employers are required to have that harassment prevention plan. So what if they don't have one? Does this mean that a worker can't make a complaint?
No, it doesn't mean that, because they have the right to make a complaint, no matter what. So yes, they can certainly make a complaint, but like you say, if in this case their employer does not have a harassment prevention plan, there are a couple of things. First of all, you can contact Occupational Health and Safety and make a complaint to
Right.
us, and then we can help to try and get that developed. But in the meantime, depending on the situation and what the trust levels are and your comfortability and so on at work, you may want to actually still bring forward the complaint. And if you can, go to somebody who you do think is impartial, that's in management or supervision or so on, you can take that to them anyways. It's actually recommended that you do,
Right.
so they can act on it
Right.
immediately. And if that doesn't work, that's another thing you can let us know.
Right.
Sometimes people might go to their employer and find out there's no harassment prevention plan, and that gets dealt with in-house without OHS
That's right.
from government
Yeah.
even knowing. But if you run into problems with that, you can always contact us and we can
Right.
help out that way.
Right. Which is a good step, obviously, for the employer to take.
Right.
It could be that they're just not aware that they need this.
Right.
And they are aware now, and they're getting it done, and they're taking care of the situation. So that's good. So we all know the importance of the Occupational Health and Safety Committee in workplaces. So one of the duties of the committee, of course, is to receive complaints. So if harassment is reported to a committee member, what should they do?
Well, if an Occupational Health and Safety Committee member receives a complaint of harassment, they could refer the person back to the reporting procedure, which is outlined in the Harassment Prevention Plan. So the Occupational Health and Safety regulations outline that the reporting procedure should be included in the Harassment Prevention Plan. So that would be the first thing. The other piece is, once someone becomes aware of harassment in the workplace, there's an obligation to report to the employer.
Yes.
So if the person is not reporting to the employer, and any employee really, including an OSH committee member or worker health and safety representative or designate, if they're made aware of harassment in the workplace, they have an obligation to report it to the employer.
Yeah. And I guess it's no different than your supervisor and your employer is your first point of contact when reporting hazards in the workplace. I guess it's really no different than that. Is it, Linda?
No, that's exactly correct. So, and this is harassment in the workplace is a hazard in the workplace, and it's being dealt with roughly in the same manner.
Yeah. Excellent. So someone is out there now and they're listening to this and they feel that a previous workplace that they worked in, that they were perhaps the victim of harassment, or maybe they were the observer of harassment. Can they still report that harassment that happened in that previous workplace?
Yeah, you can certainly make a complaint still, even after you've left the workplace, but you would have to know whether or not there's a timeline included in your former employer's harassment prevention plan that says you can't complain or submit a complaint, I should say, beyond a certain amount of time after you leave, or after the last incident is what it would normally say. And as an example, the Human Rights Commission, if you go on their website, you can see that they have a 12-month timeline.
Right.
Now that's, as we said earlier, that's not the same as your employer, but the employer can have that. We don't require it in the regulations, but that doesn't mean they don't have the right to put it in.
Exactly.
So that would need to be clarified first. But given all that, and if that's all clear, then there's no reason why a person who felt that they were being harassed and left for that reason couldn't make a complaint to their former employer. They should be looking at the harassment prevention plan to see what procedure needs to be followed to do that. And it also needs to be kept in mind that the investigation for that harassment complaint may not look the same, may turn out slightly differently than if both parties were there at the workplace, only because it might have been, a certain amount of time might have gone by, some pieces of information may not be there anymore, it might be more difficult to do. But if there is harassment at the workplace, in your opinion, then it is a hazard, like we said earlier.
Yeah.
And so it should be brought to the employer's attention, and they should have a look and investigate that and see what's going on.
Yeah. So, the purpose of any investigation that we do, and the investigation of this complaint, or any complaint, I guess, is to determine if harassment has actually taken place and to prevent it from happening again. Does an employer need to hire an external investigator to do the investigation?
Another great question, Deanne. We get this question quite a bit, actually. And that's because the answer is not clear-cut, unfortunately. I think I can tell you a few things about investigations or investigator qualities that might help listeners make that decision for themselves. So one of the first and foremost things is that any investigator has to be impartial and unbiased. And that's what their investigation needs to be based on. They have to be knowledgeable of harassment investigations and industry best practices. Again, these are not regulated requirements, except for the unbiased and impartial part. But these things are things that we know about investigations and investigators that make it all work. So the investigator should also never be someone to whom the complainant, so that's the person who makes the complaint, it should never be someone to whom the complainant actually reports to directly.
Right.
So that makes total sense.
Makes
right?
total sense.
There shouldn't be an imbalance of power and responsibility like that. And so you can see how these things start to turn out. Like the more of these things you take into account, the less people there are that can do the investigation, depending on the size of your organization.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, some people designate people within their organization to receive complaints and maybe even to investigate them. And so that person shouldn't be an employee within the work or the business unit of the complainant.
Right.
Because they're then no longer really impartial and unbiased.
Yeah.
Like a coworker or something in the same unit. And of course, there are examples of people who are external contacts and people who we mentioned earlier that need to be contacted in the case of a manager or a supervisor
Right.
being the respondent. And those external contacts would be people like legal firms possibly, or human resources firms, professional associations sometimes play that role. And there are other companies that specialize in dealing with this kind of thing, usually in the human resources field.
Right.
Because this is traditionally a human resources issue.
It is.
So those people are out there to act as external contacts.
Yeah.
And they will help find external, or what we call impartial third-party investigators.
Right.
But just to say, to make it clear that, you don't have to get an external investigator, except when in the situations I just mentioned. So when you look around and realize that you cannot get someone impartial, the smaller your organization is, the less likely you're going to be able to have somebody there who can do that impartially.
Yeah, it must be a little more difficult for smaller organizations to find that person in-house.
Yeah, and actually it's almost precluded depending on the size. And it's a difficult thing, because that means that they are then on the hook for looking for external investigators, and that's difficult for them. But we do also, I should remind the listeners as well that they may not choose to go with an external investigator, but if the OHS division gets involved for whatever reason, it could be because we just walked in and did an inspection, or because someone calls us, then we may feel that it's necessary because we don't feel it is being impartial. We might actually have to write an order to say, no, it has to be external.
Yeah.
But businesses can come to that conclusion on their own as well.
Yeah. So the investigation has been done, and the investigation finds that harassment has taken place. So what should be done with that information that has been gathered?
Okay, so first of all, every investigation needs to come out saying, or the point at least, is to try and say if the allegations are founded or unfounded. And sometimes not all of the allegations from one complainant are founded. But in any case, if they're found to be founded, then an employer is responsible to refer to their own disciplinary procedures to see what are they going to do.
Right.
So they may have disciplinary procedures in place already that say anybody who violates, for instance, an occupational health and safety policy, or a safe work procedure, or the harassment prevention plan, will face these disciplinary procedures.
Yeah.
And so that's usually the most clean-cut way. But if an employer doesn't have them, or they choose to include something like that built into their harassment prevention plan, that's their choice as well. There's nothing in the regulations that says which way to go, but that's what we've learned.
Right.
And so lots of people put it into their harassment prevention plan, and they're finding that the larger the organization, they may have disciplinary procedures elsewhere that they refer to instead.
Right. Well, this was a really, really good conversation that we had today on harassment prevention and the plan itself. So thank you to Lisa and to Linda in joining me today to discuss and answer some common questions and your very well thought out and thorough answers.
Thanks for having us, Deanne.
Thanks so much, Deanne.
Thank you for joining us today. Transcripts are available to use in your workplace to increase workers' knowledge in various occupational health and safety topics. Visit WorkplaceNL.ca for more information on the services we provide to workplaces. Feel free to share the signal on social media to improve workplace health and safety everywhere. Thank you, and have a safe and healthy day.